The sharp September sun cast long shadows across Highway 47 as Tara Calico adjusted the straps on her mother's neon pink Huffy mountain bike. At 19 years old, with her auburn hair catching the morning light and her determined stride, she embodied the spirit of a young woman ready to conquer the world. The University of New Mexico student had made this 36-mile bike ride along the winding stretch of asphalt south of Belen, a sacred morning ritual, a peaceful journey through the high desert landscape where the Sandia Mountains rose like ancient guardians against the endless New Mexico sky. On this Tuesday morning, September 20th, 1988, Tara had kissed her mother, Patty Dole, goodbye at 9:30. Promising to be back by noon for tennis with her boyfriend. The familiar crunch of gravel under her bicycle tires and the gentle hum of her Sony Walkman playing her favorite cassette tape created the soundtrack for what should have been another routine ride through the heart of Valencia County. But something felt different that morning, though neither Tara nor her mother could have predicted that this would be the last time they would see each other. If you're following this investigation with us, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. The landscape along State Road 47 was both beautiful and desolate, a stretch of two-lane highway that cut through miles of open desert, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional ranch house. This was the route Tara had chosen for her daily rides, despite her mother's growing concerns about safety. Patty Doyle had stopped joining her daughter on these bike rides after experiencing what she described as being stalked by a motorist who seemed to follow them with an unsettling persistence. She had urged Tara to carry mace, but her independent-minded daughter had dismissed the suggestion, confident in her ability to handle whatever challenges the open road might present. The morning air was crisp with the promise of another warm New Mexico day, as Tara pedaled south from her home on Brugge Street in the Rio Communities area near Belen. She had taken her mother's bicycle because her own was damaged, and the bright pink frame with its distinctive yellow control cables and sidewalls made her an unmistakable figure against the muted colors of the desert landscape. Her headphones were secured in place, the music providing a private concert as she maintained her steady pace along the familiar route. By 11:45 that morning, several witnesses would later report seeing Tara riding alone, her figure small and determined against the vast expanse of Highway 47. But they also saw something else that would haunt investigators for decades to come. Multiple eyewitnesses observed a light-colored pickup truck, possibly a 1953 Ford with a distinctive white homemade camper shell, following closely behind the young cyclist. The truck appeared dirty white or light grey in color, and its proximity to Tara struck several observers as unusual and concerning. The stretch of highway where Tara was last seen was largely unpopulated, a remote section of road that offered little in the way of witnesses or protection. The truck continued to tail her as she pedaled through this isolated area, maintaining a distance that suggested deliberate surveillance rather than coincidental travel. No one witnessed the actual moment of abduction, but the presence of that suspicious vehicle would become central to every theory and investigation that followed. When noon arrived and Tara had not returned home, Patty Dole felt the first sharp stab of maternal intuition that something was terribly wrong. Her daughter was punctual by nature, especially when she had commitments like the tennis date scheduled for 12:30. As the minutes ticked by, that initial concern grew into genuine alarm. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, after searching along Tara's usual route and finding no sign of her daughter, Patty contacted the police to report her missing. The search that followed was immediate and thorough, but what investigators found only deepened the mystery. 19 miles east of Highway 47, near the remote John F. Kennedy campground, searchers discovered fragments of Tara's Sony Walkman. The small, cracked plastic window of the device lay scattered on the ground alongside pieces of a cassette tape, the remnants of what had been providing the soundtrack to her final ride. Patty Dole would later tell investigators that she believed her daughter had deliberately discarded these items as a way to mark her trail, hoping to leave clues for anyone who might come searching for her. The discovery of these personal items suggested that whatever had happened to Tara occurred somewhere between her last sighting on Highway 47 and this remote campground location. Detectives also identified bicycle tracks on the north side of the road's shoulder, near where the cassette tape was found, evidence that suggested a possible struggle or forced stop had taken place. But despite extensive searches of the area, Tara's distinctive pink bicycle was never recovered, nor was any other physical evidence that might explain what had become of the 19-year-old student. The Valencia County Sheriff's Office immediately launched a comprehensive investigation, interviewing witnesses and following every possible lead. The description of the suspicious pickup truck was circulated throughout the region, and investigators began the painstaking process of tracking down owners of similar vehicles. But the truck, like Tara herself, seemed to have vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the haunting memory of its presence on that fateful morning. In the days following Tara's disappearance, the tight-knit community around Belen rallied together in an unprecedented search effort. Volunteers on foot, horseback, and in vehicles combed the desert landscape for any sign of the missing young woman. The high desert terrain was both beautiful and treacherous, with countless arroyos, canyons, and remote areas where someone could easily disappear. Search planes flew overhead, their pilots scanning the vast expanse below for any hint of pink bicycle frame or any other clue that might lead them to Tara. The emotional toll on the Calico family was evident from the very beginning. Patty Dole became the public face of the search effort, appearing at press conferences and pleading with anyone who might have information to come forward. Her pain was palpable as she described her daughter's character, her dreams of finishing college, and her plans for the future that had been so suddenly interrupted. The image of a mother searching desperately for her child became one that would resonate with people far beyond the borders of New Mexico. As days turned into weeks, the investigation expanded beyond the immediate area around Belen. Law enforcement agencies throughout the Southwest were alerted to be on the lookout for both Tara and the suspicious pickup truck. The Federal Bureau of Investigation joined the case, bringing additional resources and expertise to bear on what was now clearly a federal kidnapping investigation. The involvement of the FBI signaled the seriousness with which authorities were treating Tara's disappearance, but it also underscored the complexity of a case that seemed to offer more questions than answers. The media attention surrounding Tara's case grew steadily as weeks passed without resolution. Local television stations began featuring regular updates on the investigation, and newspapers throughout New Mexico carried stories about the missing university student. Her photograph, showing a young woman with a bright smile and intelligent eyes, became familiar to people throughout the state. The story had all the elements that capture public attention: a beautiful young victim, mysterious circumstances, and a family desperate for answers. But it was what happened 9 months later, in June of 1989, that would transform Tara Calico's disappearance from a regional tragedy into a national obsession. The discovery that would follow would raise more questions than it answered, and launch the case into a realm of speculation and controversy that continues to this day. The sweltering heat of a Florida summer morning pressed down on the asphalt of the convenience store parking lot in Port St. Joe, as a woman made what would become one of the most controversial discoveries in missing persons history. There, tucked beneath the windshield wiper of a car, was a Polaroid photograph that would haunt investigators and the public for decades to come. The image showed two figures, a young woman and a boy, both appearing to be bound and gagged in the back of what looked like a van or similar vehicle. The photograph was immediately turned over to local police, who recognized its potential significance and contacted federal authorities. When the image was eventually broadcast on television as part of an effort to identify the subjects, it caught the attention of family friends of the Calicos back in New Mexico. The resemblance between the young woman in the photograph and Tara Calico was striking enough that these friends immediately contacted Patty Doyle, urging her to look at the disturbing image. The moment Patty Doyle first saw that Polaroid photograph would be forever etched in her memory. Despite the poor quality of the image and the obvious distress of the subjects, she became convinced that she was looking at her missing daughter. She pointed to what appeared to be a scar on the young woman's leg that matched one Tara had received in a car accident years earlier. She noted the facial structure, the hair color, and other physical characteristics that seemed consistent with her daughter, accounting for what she described as the effects of time, possible weight loss, and the absence of makeup. The photograph sparked an international investigation as law enforcement agencies and forensic experts attempted to determine the identity of the two subjects. Scotland Yard conducted an analysis and concluded that the young woman in the image was indeed Tara Calico, lending significant credibility to Patty Doyle's identification. However, when the Los Alamos National Laboratory conducted their own independent analysis, they reached the opposite conclusion, determining that the person in the photograph was not Tara. The FBI's analysis proved inconclusive, leaving investigators and the family in a frustrating state of uncertainty. The controversy surrounding the Polaroid photograph divided experts, investigators, and even members of the Calico family and their supporters. Some saw it as definitive proof that Tara was alive, at least as of June 1989, and had been kidnapped by individuals who were holding her against her will. Others viewed it as a tragic red herring that diverted attention and resources away from the real investigation into what had happened on Highway 47 that September morning. The discovery of the photograph coincided with a significant expansion of media coverage surrounding Tara's case. Television programs like Unsolved Mysteries, America's Most Wanted, and A Current Affair featured detailed segments about her disappearance and the mysterious Polaroid. The Oprah Winfrey Show devoted an entire episode to the case, bringing national attention to the young woman from New Mexico whose fate had captured the imagination of viewers across the country. Each television appearance generated hundreds of tips and potential leads, keeping investigators busy but ultimately failing to produce the breakthrough everyone hoped for. Patty Doyle became a tireless advocate for her daughter, appearing on television programs and speaking at press conferences with a dignity and strength that impressed everyone who met her. Her unwavering belief that the Polaroid showed her daughter alive gave her hope during the darkest moments of her ordeal, but it also subjected her to intense scrutiny from skeptics who questioned her identification of the photograph. The emotional toll of constantly defending her position while simultaneously dealing with the trauma of her daughter's disappearance was enormous, but she never wavered in her commitment to finding answers. The investigation into the Polaroid photograph led authorities down numerous paths, each more frustrating than the last. Efforts to trace the origin of the photograph proved unsuccessful, as did attempts to identify the young boy who appeared alongside the woman. The vehicle shown in the background of the image could not be definitively identified, nor could investigators determine when or where the photograph had been taken. Every technical analysis seemed to raise new questions, while providing few definitive answers. Meanwhile, back in New Mexico, investigators continued their efforts to solve the original disappearance. The search for the light-colored pickup truck continued, with detectives following up on hundreds of tips from people who claimed to have seen similar vehicles in the area around the time of Tara's disappearance. Several potential suspects were identified and interviewed, but none of the investigations produced sufficient evidence to warrant an arrest. The case began to take on the characteristics of a cold file, with periodic bursts of activity following new tips or leads, but no sustained progress toward a resolution. The impact of Tara's disappearance on the small community around Belen was profound and lasting. Parents became more protective of their children, particularly young women who might be vulnerable to similar attacks. The case served as a stark reminder that even in the wide open spaces of New Mexico, danger could strike without warning. Local businesses displayed Tara's photograph, and reward funds were established to encourage anyone with information to come forward. As the first anniversary of Tara's disappearance approached, the investigation had generated thousands of pages of reports, hundreds of interviews, and countless hours of investigative work. Yet the fundamental questions remained unanswered. What had happened to Tara Calico on that September morning? Who was responsible for her disappearance? And was she still alive somewhere, waiting for rescue? The passage of time began to work against the investigation in some ways, while potentially helping in others. Witnesses' memories faded, physical evidence became harder to preserve and analyze, and the immediate urgency that had driven the initial search efforts gave way to the grim reality of a long-term missing persons case. However, advances in forensic technology offered new possibilities for analyzing existing evidence, and the continued media attention kept the case in the public consciousness, potentially encouraging new witnesses to come forward. The Calico family's ordeal was compounded by the constant stream of alleged sightings and tips that poured in from across the country. Each report of a young woman matching Tara's description had to be investigated, raising hopes that were almost invariably dashed when the lead proved false. The emotional roller coaster of these false alarms took an additional toll on a family already stretched to the breaking point by the uncertainty surrounding their loved one's fate. The years following Tara's disappearance saw significant changes in how law enforcement agencies handle missing persons cases, particularly those involving young women. The lessons learned from the investigation into her case influenced training programs, investigative protocols, and interagency cooperation efforts. While these improvements could not help Tara, they potentially benefited other families facing similar tragedies in the years that followed. By the late 1990s, more than a decade after Tara's disappearance, the case had achieved a kind of legendary status among true crime enthusiasts and missing persons advocates. Her story had been featured in books, documentaries, and countless internet discussions. The photograph from Florida continued to generate debate and analysis, with new generations of amateur investigators applying fresh perspectives to the same puzzling evidence. Yet despite all this attention and analysis, the core mystery remained as baffling as ever. The turn of the millennium brought new hope in the form of advancing DNA technology and improved forensic techniques. Cold case units were being established in police departments across the country, bringing fresh eyes and new resources to bear on unsolved disappearances like Tara's. However, the passage of time had also meant that some potential witnesses had died, moved away, or simply forgotten crucial details that might have been helpful in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance. Patty Dole's determination never wavered throughout the years of uncertainty and false hopes. She continued to advocate for her daughter, working with other families of missing persons and supporting legislative changes designed to improve the response to disappearances. Her strength became an inspiration to other parents facing similar nightmares, and her refusal to give up hope served as a powerful reminder of the bond between mother and child. The investigation into Tara's disappearance had generated numerous theories over the years, ranging from the plausible to the fantastic. Some investigators believed she had been the victim of a random crime of opportunity, targeted by someone who saw a lone young woman on an isolated stretch of highway and acted on impulse. Others theorized that she had been specifically stalked and targeted, possibly by someone who knew her routine and had been planning the abduction for some time. More controversial theories suggested connections to organized criminal activity or even human trafficking networks that might have been operating in the area during the late 1980s. While law enforcement officials generally dismissed these more elaborate scenarios as unlikely, they could not be entirely ruled out given the lack of concrete evidence pointing in any particular direction. The 20th anniversary of Tara's disappearance in September 2008 marked a significant moment in the case, bringing renewed media attention and a fresh commitment from law enforcement to pursue any remaining leads. By this time, Valencia County Sheriff René Rivera had taken a particularly active interest in the case, making statements to the media that suggested he had specific knowledge about what had happened to Tara and who was responsible. Sheriff Rivera's claims were both encouraging and frustrating to those who had been following the case for 2 decades. He stated publicly that he knew the identities of the individuals responsible for Tara's disappearance, describing them as local young men who had since grown into adults. He also claimed to know about family members who had helped cover up the crime in the years since it occurred. However, Rivera also acknowledged that without Tara's body or her distinctive pink bicycle, he lacked the physical evidence necessary to bring charges against the suspected perpetrators. These revelations sent shockwaves through the community around Belen and renewed hope among those who had never given up on finding answers in Tara's case. If Sheriff Rivera was correct in his assertions, it meant that people in the local community had been living with knowledge of what had happened to Tara for more than 20 years. It also suggested that the crime had been committed by individuals with local connections, rather than by strangers passing through the area. The implications of Sheriff Rivera's statements were enormous, but they also raised difficult questions about why arrests had not been made if the authorities truly knew who was responsible. The sheriff's explanation about the lack of physical evidence highlighted one of the most challenging aspects of prosecuting crimes where the victim's body has never been recovered. Even with circumstantial evidence and witness testimony, prosecutors are often reluctant to pursue cases without concrete proof that a crime has actually occurred. The renewed attention surrounding the 20th anniversary of Tara's disappearance led to additional media coverage and investigative efforts. Documentary filmmakers began exploring the case in greater depth, interviewing family members, law enforcement officials, and members of the local community who might have knowledge relevant to the investigation. These efforts sometimes uncovered new information or perspectives that had not been thoroughly explored in the original investigation. One particularly significant development was the work of filmmaker Melinda Esquivel, who had known Tara personally and decided to investigate her friend's disappearance for a documentary project. Esquivel's insider knowledge of the local community and her personal connection to Tara allowed her to approach the case from a unique perspective, potentially uncovering information that might not have been readily available to outside investigators. As Esquivel pursued her investigation, she reportedly began to uncover information that corroborated some of Sheriff Rivera's claims about local involvement in Tara's disappearance. However, This investigation also apparently put Esquibel herself at risk, as she later described, receiving threats that seemed designed to discourage her from continuing her research into what had happened to her former classmate. The suggestion that people with knowledge of Tara's fate were still living in the local community and were willing to intimidate those who got too close to the truth added a new and disturbing dimension to the case. It implied that the crime was not simply a matter of historical interest, but something that continued to have implications for people's safety and well-being more than 2 decades after it occurred. Throughout all these developments, the question of the Polaroid photograph continued to generate debate and analysis. New photographic analysis techniques were applied to the image with varying results and conclusions. Some experts remained convinced that the young woman in the photograph was Tara Calico, while others continued to dispute this identification. The photograph had become both a symbol of hope for those who believed Tara might still be alive and a source of frustration for those who felt it had diverted attention from more productive lines of investigation. The advances in DNA technology that had revolutionized many cold cases offered limited help in Tara's case, primarily because so little physical evidence had been recovered from the original crime scene. The fragments of the Walkman and cassette tape found near the campground had been thoroughly analyzed using the techniques available at the time, but they had not yielded DNA evidence that could be used to identify suspects or confirm theories about what had happened. The lack of Tara's bicycle continued to be one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. Unlike a human body, which might decompose or be concealed in remote locations, a bicycle is a relatively large and durable object that would be difficult to dispose of completely. The fact that extensive searches had never located the distinctive pink Huffy suggested either that it had been deliberately concealed in a very remote location or that it had been destroyed entirely. Some investigators theorized that the bicycle might hold crucial evidence about what had happened to Tara, which would explain why her abductors had taken such care to ensure it was never found. Others suggested that the bike might have been quickly transported out of the area, possibly sold or given away in a location far from New Mexico where it would not be recognized as connected to the missing persons case. The investigation into Tara's disappearance had also been complicated by the sheer number of tips and alleged sightings that had poured in over the years. While law enforcement agencies were grateful for the public's assistance, the volume of information to be processed and investigated had sometimes overwhelmed available resources. Many of the tips proved to be based on mistaken identity or wishful thinking, but each one had to be thoroughly investigated to ensure that crucial leads were not overlooked. The case had attracted attention from psychics, amateur detectives, and true crime enthusiasts from around the world, all of whom had theories about what had happened to Tara. While most of these contributions were well-intentioned, they sometimes complicated the official investigation by generating additional tips that had to be evaluated and followed up. The challenge for law enforcement was to remain open to potentially valuable information from the public while not being overwhelmed by speculation and false leads. As the case entered its 3rd decade, advances in social media and internet communication had created new opportunities for sharing information and generating tips, but they had also created new challenges in terms of managing and evaluating the constant stream of information being generated. Online forums and discussion groups dedicated to Tara's case had emerged, where amateur investigators shared theories and analyzed evidence, sometimes uncovering new perspectives that had not been considered by official investigators. The emotional impact of Tara's disappearance on her family had evolved over the years, but it had never diminished. Patty Dole had become a recognized advocate for missing persons cases, using her experience and knowledge to help other families navigate the complex and often frustrating process of searching for missing loved ones. Her work in this area had given some meaning to the tragedy of her daughter's disappearance, but it could never fully compensate for the loss she had experienced. The passage of more than 3 decades since Tara's disappearance had brought significant changes to the landscape of Valencia County and the broader Albuquerque metropolitan area. The rural highways where Tara had taken her final bike ride had been developed with new housing, businesses, and infrastructure. Some of the remote areas that had been searched extensively in the aftermath of her disappearance were no longer as isolated or inaccessible as they had been in 1988. These changes in the physical landscape were paralleled by changes in the community of people who had been involved in the original investigation or who had knowledge relevant to the case. Some witnesses had died, others had moved away, and the collective memory of the community had inevitably been affected by the passage of time. This presented both challenges and opportunities for investigators who were still working to solve the case. The introduction of new investigative techniques and technologies continued to offer hope for breakthroughs in cold cases like Tara's. Advanced forensic analysis, improved database systems for tracking criminal activity, and better interagency communication all represented tools that had not been available to the original investigators in the late 1980s. However, the effectiveness of these tools was often limited by the amount and quality of original evidence available for reanalysis. Recent developments in the case have suggested that law enforcement officials continue to believe they know the identities of those responsible for Tara's disappearance. In 2023, the Valencia County Sheriff's Office and FBI representatives announced publicly that they had identified a suspect in the case, though they stopped short of making any arrests or revealing the suspect's identity. This announcement generated renewed media attention and public interest in a case that had never been completely forgotten. The revelation that authorities believed they had identified a suspect after more than 3 decades was both encouraging and frustrating for those who had been following the case. It suggested that the investigation had never truly gone cold, and that law enforcement officials had continued to pursue leads and develop their understanding of what had happened to Tara. However, the lack of any immediate arrests also highlighted the ongoing challenges in building a case strong enough to result in successful prosecution. The announcement about a suspect renewed discussions about the various theories that had surrounded Tara's case over the years. If law enforcement officials were correct in their belief that they knew who was responsible, it would presumably resolve some of the long-standing questions about whether the crime had been committed by strangers or by individuals with local connections to the community. The impact of Sheriff Rivera's earlier statements about knowing the identities of those responsible had created a complex dynamic within the local community. If his claims were accurate, it meant that some residents had been living with knowledge of what had happened to Tara, while allowing her family to suffer in uncertainty for decades. The social and ethical implications of such a situation were profound and had undoubtedly affected relationships and trust within the community. The case of Tara Calico had become more than just a missing persons investigation. It had evolved into a symbol of the challenges faced by families of missing persons and the limitations of the criminal justice system in cases where physical evidence is scarce. Her story had been featured in academic studies of missing persons cases, training materials for law enforcement personnel, and advocacy materials for organizations working to improve the response to disappearances. The technological advances that had occurred since 1988 had also changed the nature of personal safety and criminal investigation. Cell phones, GPS tracking, security cameras, and digital communication had created new tools for both preventing crimes and investigating them when they occurred. While these advances could not help Tara retroactively, they had potentially prevented similar tragedies and improved the chances of solving cases when disappearances did occur. The story of Tara Calico serves as a reminder of how a single moment can change everything for a family and a community. Her decision to take that bike ride on September 20th, 1988, was routine and unremarkable, the kind of everyday activity that millions of people engage in without incident. The fact that this ordinary moment led to such extraordinary consequences underscores the unpredictable nature of crime and the vulnerability that exists even in seemingly safe situations. The investigation into her disappearance had consumed thousands of hours of investigative time, generated massive amounts of paperwork and evidence, and involved multiple law enforcement agencies at the local, state, and federal levels. The financial cost of the investigation had undoubtedly been enormous, though this was rarely discussed in public accounts of the case. The human cost, in terms of the impact on her family and community, was incalculable. As the case approaches its fourth decade without resolution, it continues to generate periodic bursts of media attention and public interest. Each new development, whether it involves investigative breakthroughs, technological advances, or anniversary commemorations, serves to remind people that Tara Calico was a real person whose fate remains unknown. The enduring interest in her case reflects both the compelling nature of the mystery and the universal fear of similar tragedies occurring to other families. The recent announcement about a suspect in the case has created new hope that answers may finally be forthcoming. However, the history of the investigation has been marked by numerous moments when breakthrough seemed imminent, only to be followed by disappointment and continued uncertainty. Those who have followed the case closely have learned to temper their optimism while still maintaining hope that justice may yet be served. For Patty Dole and other family members, the announcement of a suspect represents both vindication of their long-held belief that someone in the community knew what had happened to Tara and a renewed source of anxiety about whether that knowledge will finally be translated into accountability. The emotional toll of maintaining hope while dealing with repeated disappointments over more than 3 decades has been enormous, but the family has never abandoned their pursuit of answers. The case has also had lasting impacts on law enforcement practices and missing persons investigations more broadly. The techniques developed and lessons learned from investigating Tara's disappearance have been applied to other cases, potentially helping other families find answers or preventing similar tragedies. While this cannot compensate for the lack of resolution in Tara's case, it represents some positive outcome from an otherwise tragic situation. The community around Belen has been forever changed by Tara's disappearance and the investigation that followed. The knowledge that such a crime could occur in their midst, potentially committed by people they knew and trusted, has had lasting effects on how residents view their community and their personal safety. The case has become part of the local history and collective memory, a reminder of vulnerability that exists even in close-knit rural communities. The resolution of Tara Calico's case, if and when it occurs, will likely bring mixed emotions for those who have followed it over the years. While answers about what happened to her would provide some sense of closure, they cannot restore the life that was lost or undo the decades of pain experienced by her family. The case has become larger than just the search for one missing person. It represents the hopes and fears of all families who have experienced similar tragedies. The enduring mystery of what happened to Tara Calico that September morning in 1988 continues to haunt those who have followed her case. Despite decades of investigation, technological advances and periodic breakthroughs, The fundamental questions remain unanswered. Her pink bicycle has never been found, her remains have never been located, and no one has ever been held accountable for her disappearance. The recent developments suggesting that law enforcement officials have identified a suspect offer the most concrete hope in years that answers may finally be forthcoming. However, the history of the case has taught those following it to be cautious about premature optimism. The gap between knowing who committed a crime and proving it in court can be substantial, particularly in cases where physical evidence is limited and significant time has passed. What remains certain is that Tara Calico was a young woman with her whole life ahead of her when she disappeared that morning in 1988. She was a daughter, a student, a friend, and a member of a community that has never forgotten her. Her story serves as a reminder of the fragility of life and the devastating impact that a single act of violence can have on a family and community. The search for answers in Tara's case continues, driven by the determination of her family, the dedication of law enforcement officials, and the support of a community that has refused to let her be forgotten. Whether those answers will finally come in the form of arrests, convictions, and closure remains to be seen. But the commitment to finding the truth about what happened to Tara Calico on that September morning more than 3 decades ago remains as strong as ever. The case stands as a testament to the enduring power of hope in the face of uncertainty and the refusal of those who loved Tara to give up their search for justice. Her disappearance may have taken her from those who loved her, but it has not erased her from their memories or diminished their determination to find out what happened to her. In that sense, Tara Calico's story continues, even as the search for answers about her fate goes on.